Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Here on the Beyond 50 radio show, we like to acknowledge, recognize, and as well as celebrate different cultures from around the world and also give a nice glimpse into what those cultures are all about so that our listeners have a better understanding of our neighbors and our brothers all over the globe. Coming up September 15th through October 15th, we'll be celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, and what a better way to do that than to kick off this particular celebration by finding out more about the Hispanic heritage, especially that concerning that of the Toltecs. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Don Miguel Jr., and he's going to talk with us today about Mexico's ancient Toltec traditions and its history. And I'd like to welcome Don Miguel Jr. here to the Beyond 50 radio program today. Hi, Don. How are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you doing, Daniel?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Now, I understand that your father is Don Miguel Ruiz, and he's a famous shaman and best-selling author of The Four Agreements. Now,
yes.
I guess you pretty much followed in his footsteps. Is that what happened? Like father, like son?
Yes. Me and my brothers were trained by my father and my grandmother, as well as some other of my dad's apprentices, and basically just live life like that, just enjoying it.
Oh, very good. Now, tell us who the Toltecs were and about how long ago this particular, I guess, civilization existed.
Well, this lasted about 2,000 years ago, but the Toltec, the way we grew up learning about them through our family history is that Toltecs are artists. You know, it could be the Aztecs and the other Nahuatl tradition. The Toltecs were the scientists. They were the artists. Basically, the whole world was to create life, as their art, basically, And our great great grandfather, Don Ezequiel, he's the one who taught my grandma, my great grandpa, my dad, basically those cultures. Now, since the Spanish conquest came, a lot of history was basically went underground, basically with the whole Catholicism coming in and the new religion coming into the new world. The old traditions, basically were somewhat destroyed. So we have to keep it taught as a silent knowledge, basically, which is the oral tradition from grandfather to son to granddaughters, and basically, that's the way you do it.
Mm-hmm. Now, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I noticed here that you started your apprenticeship with your father and your grandmother at the age of 14, so you really picked up on this pretty early.
Yes, basically. The way they taught us is basically but my grandmother, she didn't speak any English, so the way she helped me apprentice is that I had to translate from Spanish to English, basically all of her lessons and sessions, and basically that's how I worked with her. She would sit there, do prayers, do meditations, do healings as a curandera, and that's how I learned from her. And then when I got that covered, and as I got into college, my father really started pressing me onto that. And really, real life experience in the sense that, for example, how to realize what my interpretations are came from, he would ask me questions and see how I interpreted, and then ask me, okay, so you heard it from this point of view. Now you have to learn to listen and see how it's been distorted through other people's point of view, and they all talk about the same thing. So you can say that's a bit of my upbringing. It's like the number one rule was don't believe me, and don't believe yourself, and don't believe anyone else. But learn to listen, because somewhere in what people say lies the truth. And that's basically the basis, the very basic rule in that family tradition.
Now, I know that as we've been doing our show for well over 4 years, that one of the more consistent things that we discover is that people who approach midlife tend to find this threshold or this barrier, at least for some, that they're crossing over through to where their fear begins to fall away. Now, as I see here that your father, by your mid-20s, began to intensify the training that you were receiving, and it was a way of saying, quote, find your way out, go home, and master death by becoming alive. Now, what does that mean exactly?
Basically, facing my fears. You know,
Okay.
the biggest fear we have is to live life. So life is not death, really. It's just going out there and push yourself beyond your fears, because it is the fears that we have that limit us in our life. You know, the
Right.
fear to ask a girl out, for example, the fear to go for that promotion. You know, the assumptions we make that something's going to go our way sometimes stops us. You know, and it's just going beyond that fear. You know, you can do. For example, I'd say this for this interview, I could be very nervous and say, okay, I'm going to do this anyways, and I'm going for it, and I'm talking to you, and just working through that fear. And then once you face that fear, you realize there's really nothing to fear. You know, it's a normal conversation. And once you get to that place, well, everything just falls into place. And that's true with everything in life. So when you face fear, face death, and go home and realize that everything is as it is, perfect. There's nothing to change, really. Life balances itself out, you know, with extremes, and then it goes into a different cycle. But the one constant is life. So once you have that, you no longer have that fear. But you have to face that, because growing up, it was so installed in us to believe those fears that are completely true.
Now, is it fair to say, Don, that I guess in your experience, when we talk about fear, and you say that it seems that people are really afraid to be alive, and you can see a lot of truth in how we've actually talked with people over the years where that seems eminently true, because you can ask questions, what have you always wanted to do that you haven't done yet? And inevitably people still have a position on a list, and how long have you been wanting to do that? And you realize, well, I've been wanting to do that for years, but, you know. So when you take a look at that fear of living, would it be fair to say perhaps that in the Toltec way of being, that fears are simply those things placed in our lives because those are the lessons we most need to learn, and that's why we should be engaging them?
Yes, and at the same time, there's fears that we learned.
Okay.
You know, there's two types of fears. The natural fear, which is the human body reacting to a position where it knows it's in danger. That's total fear. It's our survival mechanism. And as I said before, that's natural. The unnatural is the fears that we were taught as we're growing up.
Okay.
That being that from our parents, from our teachers, from our school, from our environment, our society. Those are the fears that are completely fictitious. You know, it's completely embedded in your mind. And somehow, some way, we were programmed to that. And those are the fears one has to really face. Because it's not true that, like, for example, if someone would say that you're ugly or that I'm incompetent, and I really believe them, then it's true. And that is a fear that one builds if they really believe that. But once you realize that you're not ugly, you're a beautiful person, and it's just simply believing someone else's point of view, and then realizing that whatever other fears you have were really based on someone else's point of view, that they didn't know that it was false, but we believe them. And in believing them, well, all these fears come up. And, you know, it's like in today's life, you know, and with all the information out there, the best way to grab attention is to spread fear some way, somehow. Be it in politics, be it in life, be in religion, being in all these things. But the reason why fear is so easy to understand or so easy to spread is because it's very addictive. It's the easiest thing to fall into or give into. And being the easiest, we can imagine how easy it is to give in throughout our whole life, and we live in life with fear. And that is, but when we face those fears, when we go beyond them and realize them for what they are, well, life begins. You know, it's the authenticity that comes back.
Right.
And that is a great life. That's the beginning of paradise on earth.
For those of you just tuning in, we're talking with Don Miguel Jr. about Mexico's ancient Toltec traditions and history. And, you know, Don, as you were talking about the fear, it's kind of interesting how elusive or illusory, if you will, it is. It's almost transparent, but we seem to think that it is real. What are the Toltec practices that help people, I guess, begin to banish that fear away on a regular, almost natural basis?
Well, the first thing we were taught in my apprentices with my father and grandmother, as well as my brothers, is paying attention, learning to be aware that I do it. It's simply being aware of my actions, my words, beginning to understand that. Once we become aware of these things, then something we call the mastery of awareness, which is basically once we're aware, we know it's coming. We know that we're putting ourselves in that position where we know that fear is going to come in or a certain tendency tends to happen, and we put ourselves through it anyways, but completely anticipating it. And with that awareness, we can change it. We can totally change what would be something natural or a typical reaction that we had before that we no longer want. Because that's actually the bottom line there. Do we want it or we don't want it? If we want it in our lives, then we'll continue doing it. It's no problem. If we want fear in our lives, then it's no problem. There's no problem whatsoever in having it. But if you don't want it, then you have to practice and practice and practice, putting yourself through it. You know, it's like, for example, if growing up and we were a little bit shy and talking to a girl was always very difficult, and if you always shy away from it and never put yourself in a position, well, that fear is going to grow and grow and grow. But if you know that you do it, then and you don't no longer want it, then what one needs to do is to put yourself in that position where you can express it. And if you fail the first time, that's fine. You pick yourself up, you forgive yourself, and you go and do it again and again to the point where you at one point will miss and no longer have that fear. All of a sudden it will become normal. And that takes such awareness and discipline, because there's the temptation of giving into the fear, not even exposing yourself. And then there's that really moment of clarity where it just goes, okay, I'm doing this. And to the point where you don't even, not even thinking about it. It's not even consuming your mind. You're just talking, and it just flows, and that fear is no longer gone. And all of a sudden, everyone will see what a bright star you are.
Mm-hmm. So then you become the light, so to speak.
Yeah, you can say that. It's an image that we use that illustrates that concept. But the reality is that light, that you become the beautiful light, is basically your authenticity. You are who you are, and that's perfect. Mm-hmm. And it's just getting to that, because living life without fear is just incredible. And that's where the Toltec come in, because once you have that fear and it's gone, then you can see your whole life as this white canvas that you can paint or create in any way, shape, or form. That's the reason why Toltecs consider themselves artists. Life is our art, and it's the life that we live from the moment we are born to the moment we pass away. It is our art.
Now, it's interesting because when you think about the times that Europe became, I don't know, more like conquistadors, you have the Spanish coming over and the whole like, and Italians, you name it, they were coming over here, and especially into Mexico, Central America, and South America, and just basically spreading their own doctrine. How was it that the Toltecs were able to preserve their culture and their teachings because a lot of that was being destroyed by these people who were coming over in their Christian or Catholic crusades, for instance, and just kind of taking that away from the people and demanding that they convert over to their way of thinking and believing. But it seems like not only the Toltecs, but also the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayans were all able to somehow preserve their culture. It was like it was unshakable. How was that possible? What was it that the Toltecs did where they could preserve that?
Well, first, we put up a great fight, but we lost. You know, we lost the battle, and you know, whenever you're a conquered in the culture, you do what's your best to survive, which is, well, we go into telling the stories through the family. We don't talk about it outside. You know, it's kind of like because what happened, and let's think back. When the conquest happened, it was right in the middle of the Inquisition in Europe. You know, like in Europe, the Jewish and other non-Christian religions were also going through something similar to where we were going, but in a different circumstance. But we were all going through it in a sense. With us, we were conquered. We were our civilization destroyed, but who we are stayed with us. You know, we couldn't just shove it away. So we also embraced the new religion. You know, the majority of us became Catholic. So we basically just began to mix. You know, a great example is the Virgen of Guadalupe. You know, the mixture of the Catholicism with indigenous culture, basically assembled in that Virgin, the image. You know, the story that Virgin Mary appeared to an Indian in central Mexico and presented the Guadalupe to the clerks, to the priest, really is a symbol of how the Toltec and the Nahuatl and the Aztecs embraced it and took on Catholicism. But at the same time, we began to teach our children and our grandchildren the stories. And little by little, we began to shed the whole concept of Quetzalcoatl, Tezcatlipoca, the whole symbols, and basically brought it to a context where you can understand it nowadays. Now, the same teachings are taught to us in a different way. Of course, the Eagle Knights in the Aztec world, there were considered warriors, they were soldiers. Nowadays, the Eagle Knights don't have that role anymore. They're not soldiers, but they're still trained in the same way with discipline, and we just adapt it. So, in the things like in certain villages that speak the Nahuatl language is still alive, but at the same time it's embracing it, and it's just one of the things that just evolves. So the oral traditions are very important to us. And the thing is that with histories, you know, we're taught the Spanish version of our history as well, because in our schools, the Spanish way of how they interpreted, like saying what Tenochtitlan is, what Teotihuacan is, how they translated that to the Spanish language, that's the language in history we know. So we're being given our own history through this. The Spaniards were now called mestizos, because now it's mixed. So you can say that history and dates have been distorted and interpreted in another culture's language, but the whole message is still with us, and it's with us because we're alive. You know, it's nature is still here with us. You know, for example, a great example of this is I'm speaking to you in English. You know, like 2 generations prior, they weren't even speaking Spanish. So, my great grandpa Don Ezequiel spoke Spanish, but barely. He was spoken in his name of Nahuatl language. Then my great grandpa Don Leonardo began to speak in Spanish because he became military in the Mexican army. And then my grandma, you know, dominated Spanish. She didn't speak any Nahuatl, but she didn't speak any English. So my father went to medical school. He began to learn the language of science, and then struggling and eventually learning English to the point where he wrote several books in English. And now here I am. I speak good English, with an accent. I don't know how to speak Nahuatl. I know words here and there, but I speak Spanish. But yet the traditions are still alive in us. We still adapt them, and by doing that, we just have to let go of a lot of the fanaticism that came with us, because there's that sector that's still fanatical and stays with that and have lost the lesson. It's just too stuck in the Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatl, and such things like that. But the lessons somehow either escape them or they're still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the nature of being conquered.
Mm-hmm.
And but life goes on. The lessons still go on. Those of us who were in families whose elders knew how to adapt still have it, and the others whose elders adapted in their own way still have it in their own way.
Right.
So it's interesting how it's evolved.
Now, briefly, as we're running toward the end of the program here, Don, tell us about how the wisdom of the Toltecs can really actually help our society today.
Well, how to help society today is very simple. Is going back to common sense, to basically to be impeccable with oneself. The authenticity of not being conquered by our fears. Because that's what the Eagle Knights, that's what their battle really was. It wasn't really a military battle. It was a battle, a war against fear, to fully live life. So what we can teach our modern day culture, be it here in the United States or across the world, is very simple. Learn to live and be completely present in the moment and just enjoy being your authentic self.
Well, very good, Don. It's been a pleasure to have you on our program today. Is there a website people can go to where they can find more out about, for instance, the book that was written by your father, as well as whether there are seminars that they can attend?
Of course. Thank you, Daniel. Basically, the website is miguelruiz.com. That's MIGUEL Ruiz .com. And that's where my brother, Jose, who's our Nahual, and my dad and myself have events coming up and such. I'm not sure. I think that we have a couple of power journeys to Mexico in October, November. In October with myself, and November with my brother. And yeah.
Well, very good. Well, Don Miguel Jr., thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today and sharing with us the value of the ancient Toltec wisdom and history. And it's been a real pleasure to have you on our program today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure for mine, Daniel. Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
You too. And we want to thank Don Miguel Jr. for joining us today and talking with us about the wonderful thing known as the Toltec traditions. Very, very fascinating stuff. Coming up on the Beyond 50 radio program, we're going to be talking with William Sullivan about his book, Listening for Coyote, so you'll want to stay tuned. Very interesting stuff right here. Would you like to tap into more of your brain's innate abilities, enter meditative states reliably and easily, reduce stress, be more creative and productive, concentrate and focus your attention when needed, experience deep restorative sleep and refreshing cat naps, or uncover your intuitive talents? You can do this and much more with the aid of HemiSync audio CDs. Refined with over 50 years of research and development and supported by numerous independent studies, reports, and articles, the patented HemiSync technology has been scientifically and clinically proven to be effective. Visit the Monroe Products website at www.hemi-sync.com. That's www.hemi-sync.com. Or just simply call toll-free 1-800-541-2488. That's 1-800-541-2488 to learn how this exceptional technology can help you achieve your greatest potential. Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis, and we've got a marvelous show for you right ahead. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is the writer for the Oregonian, William L. Sullivan, who took a 65-day, 1,361-mile solo backpacking trek across the state of Oregon. His route traversed 4 mountain ranges and 18 designated wilderness areas. He went through fog-bound rainforests, windswept glacial cirques, and sun-baked desert canyons. So he's going to talk with us today about these wonderful experiences in his book, Listening for Coyote. And joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is William Sullivan. And William, thank you for joining us today here on the program.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
Now, gee whiz, 1,361 miles on a solo backpacking trek. Did you have enough food?
Well, I couldn't take it all with me at once. Because we're talking, that was 66 days. So I divided it up into 9 segments and made 9 little food boxes of food and new camera film and empty journals, and sent them ahead to family and friends who would meet me at mountain passes along this way. So, yeah, I didn't have to carry it all at once, but I did have to carry enough for 10 days to 2 weeks at a time.
Mm-hmm. Now, what made you, or what was the inspiration for you to do what you wanted to do? Was this so that people could know Oregon, I guess, in a different way than your typical tourist books and whatever the like is out there? Was it just something you just felt like you had to do?
Well, there is that ethereal reason, yes, but there's also a practical one. I write books. Mm-hmm. And I figured I wanted to research a guide to the new wilderness areas because Congress had just tripled the number of wilderness areas in Oregon. Most people didn't even know the names of many of these places, and I figured, well, I'll go write a guidebook to them. To do that, I obviously had to visit them all. And I was broke, so I figured, well, I'll just walk through them all in one long trip.
There you go.
It'll save gas money. But then I also thought, in addition to getting sort of a nuts and bolts wilderness guidebook, I'd keep a journal of my adventures and do some research first and come up with sort of an ethereal, like you say, look at what wilderness means today. And this has a long tradition, especially in Oregon, because we're at the end of the Oregon Trail. Mm-hmm. 1 out of every 1,000 people in America in the mid-1800s sold everything they had and got in a wagon and came thousands of miles across the wilderness to get to Oregon. This is a migration that's kind of hard to imagine. And so a huge percentage of the population out here still has this sort of wanderlust. And this, I wanted to sort of track that down, see if it still existed. You're out there still?
Yeah, still, absolutely.
Yeah, I thought I lost you on the trail.
Okay.
No.
No, it was interesting because I was just thinking of our last guest, Don Miguel, who was talking about in Toltec that the first thing to grapple with is to banish fear so you can learn to live. And then as you were talking about the people who were migrating to Oregon on the Oregon Trail, you realize when you sell everything you have, you're pretty much giving away your security and you're facing the unknown, and that's seriously facing fear. And you kind of wonder, how come we sort of have lost that over the many years since that time? We're only talking, not even 200 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, something like that, when this was happening. And in that short period of time, it seems you just don't hear about that as much. And for those people who do it, for instance, such as yourself, it seems almost heroic because we just can't comprehend that level of faith to go and do something like that.
And I think that's one big reason that we do have wilderness areas set aside in America. They don't have these to the same extent anywhere else in the world. It's partly because we need this. This is part of our heritage, to have a place where Boy Scout troops could go get lost and starving and wet and cold and hungry, and an average person who works in the city and can go out there with tennis shoes and actually experience the thrill of real risk. And this sense of adventure, we don't really want to completely lose that. And that's one reason these wilderness areas are still there. Some place that is not entirely safe that we can go experience.
Now, what do you think was probably the most challenging moments of your 65-day trek? Perhaps it could be storms, or it could be people. What did you find where you thought, geez, what did I get myself into this for?
There were many of these, and we'll probably touch on them in the next half hour. But just starting with the very first ones, I took a bus to the westernmost city in Oregon because my goal was to walk from the westernmost point of the state, which is a cape that sticks way out in the Pacific Ocean, Cape Blanco, and then follow the Crescent Mountain Ranges to the easternmost point of the state. And that is at the bottom of Hell's Canyon up against Idaho. Not a lot of people go there. Anyway, you take a bus to the westernmost city, which is Port Orford, and then a walk down the beach to get to this cape. Seems straightforward, right?
Uh-huh.
Except the rivers had changed course since my maps were made, and the Elk River now ran across the beach, and it's chest deep. And you ford this with a backpack over your head, and you're not entirely sure you won't float out to sea. So there you have, the very first obstacle is even getting to the start of the thing. And then when I get to the westernmost point, I want to put my foot on the very tip of the cape out there. You go up there, and there's a big chain link fence and a sign that says Coast Guard property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. And you're thinking, oh, darn, I can't really get to the westernmost point because the Coast Guard has a lighthouse out there. But then I see a woman wandering around in the bushes on the far side of the fence. I say, hello, how did you get through the fence without getting arrested? And she said, oh, I'm from the Coos Bay Audubon Society, and we've gotten permission from the Coast Guard to look for migrant yellow warblers out here. I said, well, could I come look for migrant yellow warblers too? Well, I don't know why not. So I went out there and we actually found a few yellow birds, but then I put my foot on the westernmost point and another obstacle overcome. I actually get to start at the westernmost point and head inland. So there's just a couple of the very first ones. I suppose later that same day I hit another low point. I'm walking now east across the state. I get like 5 miles. The pack is 60 pounds. This really, I wasn't used to wearing this because, I'd been training for months, but still, you're not really quite ready for it. And then so I see a pioneer cemetery beside the road I'm walking, and I figure I'll just rest there against one of the tombstones, take off the pack for a while, take off the pack and look at the tombstone. It has my name on it. The tombstone was for William Sullivan, who was apparently a pioneer beach miner who died at the age of 86 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, I'm already dead. I mean, this is like the worst thing that could happen to you already. You finished that. It's going to be uphill from here on out. And so I figured with that behind me, I have nothing left to fear, having already faced my own death.
Now, tell me how you decided to come up with the name Listening for Coyote.
Well, coyote is more than one thing. A coyote, as the people out here call it, is, of course, a critter. This is a wild animal that is very good at outfoxing almost everything. The government's been trying to eradicate them, and they keep spreading. They're clever. Really
if I might make an interesting point on that, Will, as I remember watching a documentary, I think it was about Yellowstone in the realm of the coyote, and they were saying how they were trying to eradicate the coyote as they discovered it was like, as you would say, kill one, it's like 10 more took its place. It's like you were triggering this survival mechanism that actually helped them breed more and more coyotes to ensure the survival of the species. And I thought, That's fascinating. So if you leave them alone, their population reduces, but if you start trying to waste them, then it just kind of explodes. It's like every one you shoot blows into 3 or 4 of them, and quite interesting stuff.
And they do have their own population balance in their own place. Without coyotes, you wind up with rabbits and rodents everywhere, and they go in and destroy the farm fields. So you got to have coyotes. They're important, but it's not just the critter. There's also a spirit, and according to Indian legend, here on the West Coast, Coyote was the trickster god who created mankind long ago and has been up to no good ever since. Yeah. Out in Alaska, the tribes up there use raven as their trickster god. Is sort of but especially the Southwest, Arizona, California, Coyote, and in Oregon too. The tribes all have legends about Coyote, and he's in the legends. This is in the days before there were human beings, and in those early days, the animals walked around on 2 feet and talked, and were basically a lot like people. And these were spirit gods, really. And Coyote, of them, was the most powerful, but also the most foolish. He was always getting into mischief, bragging, and then being tricked into eating his own broiled anus, for example. I mean, everybody was playing jokes on him, too. So, but he kind of represented, for me, the spirit of the wilderness. Here was this powerful demigod who's been around since time began and did create people, according to most of these legends, and sort of represents the spirit of the wilderness. And so whenever I hear a coyote howl on this hike, it has a double meaning for me. And in the course of the book, I did run into coyotes and coyotes. And I sort of use both pronunciations. A coyote is the critter, and a coyote, for me, is the spirit.
Now, I know as you read through the book that it's really interesting how you touch on key areas throughout the Oregon and even Northern California mountain ranges. Let's talk about Mount Shasta, because I know that was an area that I more or less enjoyed as a child, going up to, say, Shasta Lake. And I've seen Mount Shasta, but it wasn't until about probably 8 years ago, give or take, that I actually went into Shasta City, which is right there at the base of Mount Shasta. But there's something that's very unique about how it feels in that area. So let's talk about the history of Mount Shasta, why it feels, I guess, sort of spiritual, if you will, when you're in that area.
Yeah, it does. And as I hiked the crest of the Siskiyous, Mount Shasta is always to your right hand. It's always out there. This is 14,000-foot mountain. And it is alone. There are no other mountains anywhere near that size, anywhere near it. The other tallest peaks are like 7,000 feet, so it stands head and shoulders above anything for 100 miles. And it's covered with glaciers, so it looks like a chunk of Antarctica floating in the clouds above the great black forests of Northern California, as poet Joaquin Miller. He called it lonely as God and white as a winter moon. White Shasta floats above the great black forests of Northern California. And it has been a source of inspiration and power for a long time. The Indians in the area, the Wintu tribe that still live there, would never go above timberline. It's taboo to do that. And so when a ski resort built a ski resort above timberline there in the 60s, they said, watch out. And a few years later, an avalanche wiped out every trace of the ski resort, right down to the foundations. There was nothing left. They didn't rebuild there. And they rebuilt it on a different hill nearby, not on the mountain. Yep. And now you go up to timberline at Mount Shasta, and people from all over the world camp there. There is a Buddhist seminary. There's the Rosicrucians, the I.M. Foundation, many of these religions. hold Mount Shasta as sacred and special. And when you're in that area, there's always people with drums beating and hanging dream catchers in trees and chanting and running around half naked and basically violating all those taboos of the Indians in the area. But you're right; it does have a special power.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting too, as I listen to you talk about your experience, that I really enjoy is growing up and going camping, especially if you go to like a boys' club camp or a summer camp, is that you get an opportunity to enjoy stories, especially campfire stories. And you can see where if you take a journey such as what you have done, you can arm yourself with an arsenal of really enjoyable, provoking campfire stories. And one of the most unique, I suppose, of the creatures, if you will, is Sasquatch. Now, you visited that domain. Tell us about that because, just recently I'm sure you know that they had decided there was a Sasquatch that was found dead for some strange reason in the southeastern part of the United States.
As if
what is a Sasquatch doing in the southeastern part of the United States? That's a Northwest phenomenon almost.
Yeah, as if he'd be down there. I'm sorry.
You're looking for an alligator for shoes, or?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and if he did stray down there, somebody'd probably kill him. You see, and that's the danger. Anyway, yeah, you're right. There have been also stories about giant ape men since the 1800s when miners would get scared and run out of the woods claiming that they'd seen such a thing. And to be honest, I personally have never run into a Sasquatch. And I've hiked 10,000 miles in Oregon and every trail I could find. But then those who believe say that's because he doesn't want to be seen by you. He picks who he would expose himself to. And so, the Forest Service actually, on the route of my hike, issued a permit for a Sasquatch hunter to capture one. And the sort of like a deer tag or something. And they built a trap with a heavy, massive wooden trap with a big steel grate in the front of it and tied a live goat inside as bait and camped out there for several summers and never caught one and finally gave it up. I guess they're just too wary. Yeah, so that's a legend that may never be proved or disproved. You can't prove a negative. So it's really impossible to prove that they don't exist.
Well, it's really interesting, especially if you're in the deep woods of the Northwest, that you can't help but think, well, I wonder, if it's possible that Bigfoot is out here, for instance, and is it looking for me? And, so that, therefore you got, again, a very unique story. Now, there were a couple of strange encounters that you had according to the book, Looking for Coyote, and some of them really caught my attention here. You have political scientist who leaves his classroom to protect Bald Mountain from the Forest Service. But the one that really got me was an ancient widow in a remote gold mining cabin.
Yeah. Gosh, I wish I could just read you that section, but it's a little too long. But here's this 80-year-old widow, and her husband died years ago, and she's in a plank shack in the wilderness and has gotten used to living out there and just won't leave. And so I do a visit with her, and she asked me to help cut her toenail, which apparently she dropped a wrench on 40 years ago and has grown into this sort of deformed-looking toe. And I say, well, can't you get a doctor out here? Don't you have a telephone? She said, yeah. They had a telephone after the war, but it didn't work, so they came and took it back. And the doctor is 40 miles away in Cave Junction, and I don't have a ride in there, so I think I'll just live with the toe. Basically, self-reliant and living out there. I thought you were going to mention my encounter with the marijuana grower, of all things. Didn't bring up
well, we got the poisonous mushroom, so that's pretty much going to segue right into that, I'm sure.
Okay. Yeah. because in that same area, southwest Oregon, this is in the Siskiyou Mountains, pretty remote country.
Mm-hmm.
I ran out of water, and it was over 100 degrees, and so I took a faint trail down to a creek and found a rope across the trail and a snarling dog, and a guy jumps out with an ammo belt across his shoulder and a big .44 revolver, and he's all in camouflage fatigues, and says, "Hey man, what are you doing here?" I say, "Well, I'm just hiking through." He says, "No, you're not. You're going to stay here and have lunch." And I say, "Okay, let's do lunch." And he's got me, so I sit there and have lunch, and he's got me covered with his gun the whole time. And finally, after 3 hours, he says, "You know, I don't think you're a pot pirate after all." I said, "No, I'm not." "Or a SWAT team." I said, "No, I'm not with the police." He said, "Well, you really had me going there. I thought you were going to steal my marijuana because I've been growing a patch out here and hope to cash it in and buy a one-way ticket to a tropical island in the Indian Ocean where I'll live like a billionaire forever." So we struck a deal out there, since I told him I was a writer, that I could tell his whole story and print his picture if I waited 3 years, or else, and this is his side of the deal, or else he would kill me. I said, "That works for me. It works for me." So I waited 3 years and told his story. And hope that he's out there. Ron, if you're listening, I kept my end of the deal, okay?
Now, you visited and you have basically stayed in a lot of wonderful places in the national designated wilderness areas, and I'm sure that none of them were ever the same. Were there any that really stood out for you in the experiences that you had?
There's nothing like Hell's Canyon anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
This is deeper than the Grand Canyon. It's bigger than the Grand Canyon. And no one goes there. Unlike the Grand Canyon, which has paved roads and big lodges and hotels and stuff on the rim, and even a lodge and a hotel on the bottom, trails everywhere. And this one, there's nothing but a bad gravel road that goes up to the rim, and then just faint horse trails that go down into it. And it's 100 miles long with nothing in it but these faint horse trails, and this is a big area. And to hike through that at the end of this hike, by then it was getting to be late October, and there were snowstorms all the time. That was truly an adventure. It's just so huge. It's hard for anybody to picture this. I described it as the ragged edge of a broken planet, with 14 terraces of basalt rim rock descending down into a hazy canyon that it's a mile deep, over a mile deep. And then the Snake River, unbridged, impassable. On the other side is Idaho. It's just a very wild and a dangerous place to be if you don't have a good way home.
Well, it's really very unique to, you're talking about taking 65 days out of a year to experience what you did here, which isn't a whole lot of time. You might even say for some people this might even be a good mini retirement, if you will, just so you can really enjoy not only the land but how you are in it. If somebody does this, do they tend to feel a marvelous or wonderful transformation about re-engaging into a world where you're back in society, you're back to doing the 9-to-5 thing, or maybe even sometimes they just might abandon that lifestyle altogether and do perhaps what you do, which is to go write books?
Well, a lot of people actually do long-range hikes. Hundreds hike the Pacific Crest Trail, probably 300, 400, maybe 500 hike the Appalachian Trail every year. And these are 2,000-mile trails, and they all say that they get into a different rhythm out there, that life is really determined by dawn and dusk, and you watch the sky more. When in your ordinary life in the cities, you don't pay much attention to the sky. You might glance at the news or the weather report on TV, but when you get outside, do you really go up and stare at the sky? Because that's the big news report when you're out there for months at a time. Is what is the sky doing? Is it going to rain? What do those clouds mean? You don't have any other weather report, and not many other people to talk to. So you wind up paying a lot of attention to it and watching the sunsets and sunrises and the sun playing on the clouds and then the stars coming out. These are suddenly become old friends, and you can see why the ancients gave names to the constellations and the planets. These are your fellow travelers out there when you're hiking.
Well, it's such a marvelous experience. Now, I'm curious what you plan on doing. Do you plan on doing more of these, but finding other parts of the United States to do these in, or is this kind of a one-shot deal and you're going to move on to something else?
Well, some people get hooked on this, and for them it becomes an athletic challenge. I did the Appalachian Trail, now I'm going to do the Continental Divide Trail. And it's ticking off the miles and just keeping a logbook. And to me, that sort of athletic challenge, that wasn't the whole goal. It was more of a spiritual and inner challenge, challenging myself, exploring this area. So I have gone back and re-hiked virtually everything that I hiked because I have written guidebooks to Oregon Outdoors. And in doing that, I've hiked every trail I could find in Oregon, not just the ones I hiked there, but every trail in the state. And I go back and re-hike them all the time. But I guess I'm not into that long-distance challenge just as, saying, yeah, I did it. It's more the challenge is overcoming something in yourself.
I see, I got you. So you actually really do it more for the enjoyment of just doing.
Yeah, and really exploring new areas. So I do explore a lot of new stuff. And you're right, I write a lot of books, too. I've written, books about Oregon history and adventure. Just did one on Oregon's natural disasters, floods, fires, earthquakes, tsunamis, and sort of, I guess, more adventures.
Now, I'm curious here, I remember reading through this that you talk about Oregon's shy rattlers.
Well, and I do plan to do a book on Oregon wildlife coming up, too, because there are a lot of misunderstandings about, especially bears, cougars, and rattlesnakes. I guess 3 animals that could conceivably kill you, but no one has ever been killed by a bear or a cougar in the history of the state of Oregon. So this is not really a threat to hikers. And the rattlesnakes, once every 10 years. And then it's people dying of fright or doing something crazy, because the rattlesnakes in Oregon are not that venomous. It's sort of like a bad bee sting. It'll hurt really bad for 3 days, and then you'll be okay. So
the bite is worse than its bark.
Yes.
In some ways.
Well, some people absolutely flip out and do weird things, and so I think there's nothing to fear except fear of self when it comes to the wild animals. So, no, I don't. I guess, yeah, your bigger fear might be hypothermia, getting lost in cold, conceivably running into some person who is whacked out. But even that, you learn when you're out in the woods, you've left a lot of the crazies behind. There's the people you meet out there are interesting, and they all have stories to tell. But even the marijuana grower, when it came right down to it, wasn't really dangerous. He was lonely and wanted to talk. And the animals that I met were mostly very shy and curious about me, and then would run away. So dangers in the wilds, not so bad. The biggest danger is your own fear.
Especially if you come across a camouflaged elk hunter who hopes to be reincarnated as a stag elk.
Yeah. Well, I
there's somebody who seems to understand their animal totem.
Yeah. Fortunately, this guy was a bow hunter, and bow hunters when you run into them, are less dangerous than rifle hunters, because the bow hunters really have to be within 100 yards to get a decent shot, and they really have to very, very good view, and they're really pretty careful folks. I've met a few incautious rifle hunters who will, shoot first and ask questions later. That's the exception, but it is possible, and you read about that. So you basically do have to be a little bit careful in hunting season in the woods, I suppose.
Well, it's a wonderful book for people who feel like they want to be inspired with a sense of yearning for adventure, and certainly understanding the area that they live in with a deeper, greater compassion. And even more so as you take on the experience, that you realize you start to build a nice repertoire of good campfire stories. And it seems to me like that's your next goal, is maybe to start telling campfire stories at different camps around Oregon and Southwest Washington. I think you might have found a nice little niche there.
Yeah, I guess I have a book called Cabin Fever, which kind of does some campfire stories and ghost stories too. So yeah, I guess I can do that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, again, the book is Listening for Coyote, and with us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today, I'd like to thank William Sullivan for joining us here. And again, William, it was a pleasure to talk with you again about your wonderful adventures, just finding your own way to adventure itself.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you again for joining us today. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and be sure to visit our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. We also archive our shows, so you can listen to William's adventures here in wandering across Oregon's wilderness, and maybe find that as you feel inspired with his story, that you'll decide that maybe I can be a campfire linguist as well. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Also, Don Miguel Jr. for sharing with us the ancient Toltec wisdom and history, to realize that what you need to do is get past the fear and start living. And that's what it's all about here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Again, thank you for tuning in. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.